This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by our wonderful friends at World Anvil.
World Anvil is the ultimate web-based world-building platform and campaign manager.
It's one of the best digital tools for dungeon masters to organize their campaign notes.
World Anvil features easy-to-use templates to help you create and detail your world. It's great to use during game preparation or at the table.
World Anvil's interactive maps let you share your entire world with your players, while keeping secrets and hidden information for yourself.
They've just added an all-new WYSIWYG editor, which is a massive improvement to the speed and flexibility of the platform.
A basic account with World Anvil is totally free and offers you all the tools you need to get started.
The Master and Grandmaster subscriptions unlock advanced sharing and presentation features. You can save up to 20% off with the discount code DungeonDudes.
You can follow the links in the description below for more information or sign up at worldanvil.com.
And now, onto this week's episode.
The player characters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition come from very humble beginnings at first level, struggling to overcome low-level creatures, but as they gain levels, they gain new abilities, powers, spells, potent weapons, and powerful defenses, which allow them to confront the most formidable foes as they progress into the mid and high levels of play.
But don't let your newfound powers give you newfound overconfidence. Because as you will find, there are many terrifying and deadly monsters hidden in the dark places of the Dungeons & Dragons worlds.
My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we discuss everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are taking a look at 5 of the deadliest monsters that you will find at the mid-levels of play in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
We're taking a look at the Monster Manual, Volo's Guide to Monsters, and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes for the entries onto this list.
We looked at monsters between the challenge rating of 3 and 10. We covered monsters of a lower challenge rating in a previous video. And while we were looking at these monsters, we ended up only choosing monsters that capped out, I believe, at CR 8 with a variant.
We also negated legendary monsters and named NPCs from this list, wanting to focus more on the generic monsters that you can find in all of these books.
Monsters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition really come into their own at medium levels of play. We start seeing monsters with some truly unique and interesting abilities to challenge the player characters, whether or not that's in direct combat. And of course, in combat situations, we see a lot of damage-dealing powerhouses. But for this video, we were looking for something truly special and terrifying.
We wanted monsters that had a deadly edge, some sort of ability or trait that could circumvent the player's best defenses.
At low levels of play, while your player characters are 3rd, 4th, or 5th level, you can use these monsters as deadly challenges and boss monsters. But at higher levels of play, you can use them in groups to really scare the pants off your players and give them a very unique challenge that they have to think their way through.
Beyond including these monsters in the top 5, we haven't ranked them from best to worst. We're just going through them in alphabetical order. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
To kick our list off today, we have a deadly threat from the pages of Volo's Guide to Monsters. An undead monstrosity birthed by the malevolent will of the demon lord Orcus. The Bodak is a terrifying threat that has confounded and destroyed player characters for several editions of Dungeons & Dragons.
Found on page 127 of Volo's Guide to Monsters, this creature is terrifying to behold. The image of this creature with its extended face and horrifying cloak and gross-looking arms and limbs stumbling towards the party, horrible for the party to look upon, and has some really interesting effects that can totally mess up a combat encounter.
The visual image and lore of the Bodak is fantastic and is backed up by its stats. Let's take a look at just how horrifying these things are in play.
The Bodak is challenge rating 6 and comes with a bevy of damage immunities, condition immunities, resistances. There's a lot that it's going to be taking half damage from, and some things that are not even going to hurt it at all.
If your party does not have magical weapons, they will find chewing through its rather feeble 58 hit points pretty difficult, in fact.
Entering combat with a Bodak is a challenge unto itself because as you get close to it, within 30 feet, you are open to both its Aura of Annihilation and its Death Gaze abilities.
The Bodak's Aura of Annihilation is the less deadly of the two abilities, but it automatically deals 5 necrotic damage with no saving throw to any creature that ends its turn within 30 feet of the Bodak, easily racking up tons of passive damage just for engaging the Bodak in melee.
If you do look upon the Bodak, you'll have to make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw, taking 3d10 psychic damage on a failed save.
However, if you fail this saving throw by 5 or more, you are instantly reduced to 0 hit points unless you are immune to the frightened condition. What makes this especially deadly is that once you are reduced to 0 hit points at the start of your turn, at the end of your turn, you'll now automatically fail a death saving throw because you get hit by the Aura of Annihilation. So you could find yourself at the very end of your turn on the ground with 2 failed death saves just for starting your turn within 30 feet of a Bodak. A pretty deadly proposition, if you ask me.
If that weren't enough, the Bodak has an ability called Withering Gaze, which has a range of 60 feet, and you are forced to make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw, taking 4d10 necrotic damage if you fail.
Bodaks are incredibly deadly. Every time I've used them at my table, someone has missed their saving throw against that death glare and dropped immediately, and that puts the entire party in an immediately defensive position. They're faced with the difficult prospect of trying to deal with their fallen ally, who has now lost all of their hit points immediately without any damage even going through, and they still have to deal with fighting the Bodak, which even the prospect of saving the fallen party member might expose other party members to its death gaze.
There are many monsters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that have gaze attacks, and we looked at a lot of them. But by far, the Bodak is one of the scariest and deadliest monsters that I personally have ever faced as a player, and putting it against a party is really a fun option for the DM and a terrifying option for the players.
The best way to confront a Bodak if you have to face one is to stay well away from it, if at all possible. Unfortunately, Bodaks as undead creatures often haunt underground crypts and other cramped environments, and may also be surrounded by other undead creatures and fiends who are immune or resistant to the Bodak's special abilities.
So if you have magic weapons, ranged attacks, or anything that can exploit its hypersensitivity to sunlight, then you're at the advantage for taking out a Bodak quickly. The next monster we're going to look at today is the Catoblepas, which is found in Volo's Guide to Monsters on page 129.
Is that actually how you pronounce it?
According to Matt Mercer, yes.
I thought it was Catoblepas.
I have pronounced it, I think, different every time I've said it, but apparently, according to D&D Beyond, Catoblepas is the appropriate pronunciation.
However you want to pronounce it, this rather obscure creature from real-world myths and legends has found its way into Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition as a challenge rating 5 monster, with a host of pretty deadly abilities that make for a rather obscure threat that the player characters might not necessarily see coming.
This is a large, rather smelly creature that has thick fur covering its hide and a mace-like tail.
The Catoblepas can smash player characters who dare approach it with its mace-like tail, dealing a boatload of damage and potentially stunning them if they fail a DC 16 Constitution saving throw. In addition, simply approaching the Catoblepas means that you have to make a saving throw against its horrific stench, which can leave you poisoned.
But these are nothing compared to its Death Ray ability, which allows the Catoblepas to target a creature within 30 feet of it, causing them to make a DC 16 Constitution saving throw, taking 8d8 necrotic damage on a failed save, or half as much on a successful one.
But if you fail this saving throw by 5 or more, similar to the Bodak, you take a full 64 points of necrotic damage as the damage is maximized. What's worse, regardless of if you succeed your saving throw, fail your saving throw, or fail your saving throw by 5 or more, if the death ray reduces your player character to 0 hit points or fewer, you are killed outright.
This ability recharges on a 5 or 6, meaning that the Catoblepas has a chance of using it several times within a combat encounter, which means at challenge rating 5, a level 5 party could be hit multiple times with the death ray, and that could cause a few player deaths. The downfall of a lot of classic monsters is that everybody in the world has heard of them and knows about them and is aware of some of their abilities. But a party facing this creature might not have heard of it before and will not be prepared for that death ray.
Despite its deadly abilities, the Catoblepas has no special defenses beyond its smell, and it doesn't have a very high AC or a lot of hit points for a challenge rating 5 creature, so it could be taken out pretty quickly by a decisive party.
From the pages of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes comes a creature straight out of the abyss, the Maurezhi.
The Maurezhi is a challenge rating 7 fiend found on page 133 of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. It is a demonic ghoul, master of such creatures, and found at the forefront of the forces of Orcus and Dorsain, the Ghoul King.
The Maurezhi is a horrific blend of the best and worst of both demons and undead.
The Maurezhi is a dastardly fiend, ready to lead a horde of undead creatures. With its intelligence and telepathy, as well as a host of damage resistances and a few key immunities, it is ready to be at the forefront of a battle line.
The Maurezhi can also be a deadly infiltrator thanks to its Assume Form ability, where if it kills something, it can absorb their essence and basically become a mimic of them for 1d6 days, allowing it to infiltrate the entire party or a town or appear anywhere. It could be anybody.
It can kill its victim and effectively wear it like a skin coat. A pretty grisly image, if you ask me.
You'll notice at first that it has a bite attack, but if you look closely at this bite attack, if you hit with it, it reduces the character's charisma score by 1d4, and if they're reduced to 0 in this way, they die.
And then they raise up as another ghoulish minion of the Maurezhi. The Maurezhi's bite is a very rare example of an attack which hits and with no saving throw deals damage to characters' ability scores. Given that charisma is either a very high ability score for many characters like bards and paladins that rely on it, but for almost every other class, many player characters have charisma scores of 10 or 8. So only a few bites from a Maurezhi will have you joining its demonic legion of undead terrors.
And then once it's turned you into a ghoul to join its army, it can wear your body as a skin suit and walk around pretending to be you.
Pretty horrifying. Like all good ghoulish creatures, the Maurezhi's 2-claw attacks are incredibly deadly, not because they deal a lot of damage, but because they have a chance to paralyze a target on a failed Constitution saving throw. Finally, the Maurezhi also has the ability to raise up ghouls and ghasts which have been killed in its vicinity, raising them up with full hit points. Pretty dastardly.
So with its array of resistances and benefits, and then on top of that, each of its attacks having a little bonus that can either paralyze you, reduce your charisma, while it's raising an army of ghouls, makes this an extremely formidable foe.
The Maurezhi is another creature that its rather innocuous appearance might confuse the player characters at first, thinking that it is itself a ghoul when in fact it is a fiend. So the cleric might be very surprised when they try to turn undead, and the Maurezhi continues forward unabated and unaffected by that ability.
Although the paladin might be ready with another smite to knock it out. Although Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes and Volo's Guide to Monsters have given us a slew of deadly monsters to face, we're going to return back to the monster manual for one of the greatest, most classic, and deadliest monsters the game has to offer in the Mind Flayer.
Mind Flayers are the classic Lovecraftian psionic archvillains, found on page 222 of the monster manual and clocking in at challenge rating 7, or challenge rating 8 if you choose to apply the Arcanist or Mind Flayer Scion variants found in the monster manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters.
Monty and I both love Mind Flayers and look for every opportunity to use them in our games. We actually did an entire video covering Mind Flayers exclusively, but we couldn't exclude them from this list because of how great they are.
Mind Flayers are not physically formidable creatures. They don't have a lot of hit points for a challenge rating 7 creature, a very high armor class, but they more than make up for it with their brilliant alien minds, unique sets of skills, and their truly deadly attacks.
The main ability that we are all here for is Mind Blast, which is an ability that recharges on a 5 or 6. Mind Blast delivers a 60-foot cone of psionic energy that causes the characters inside to make a DC 15 intelligence saving throw, taking 4d8 plus 4 psychic damage and becoming stunned for 1 minute.
Creatures stunned by the Mind Flayer's Mind Blast are prey for its other iconic ability, Extract Brain, which can only be used against a creature the Mind Flayer has grappled, which is also incapacitated. Once done so, though, the Mind Flayer can simply suck the brains out of the target's body, dealing 10d10 or 55 damage to the creature, which kills them instantaneously if this damage reduces them to 0 hit points.
The Mind Flayer's tentacle attack is not to be underestimated as well, as it has the potential of grappling its victim and stunning them, which can then lead to an Extract Brain situation.
This is to say nothing of the Mind Flayer's magic resistance and its innate spellcasting abilities, which include spells like Dominate Monster, Levitate, and Detect Thoughts, and the popular variants for Mind Flayers, which include Psionic and spellcasting variants.
It's also worth noting that Mind Flayers are psionic commanders who usually have a host of minions at their disposal, and any encounter with a Mind Flayer should be met equally with a slew of horrifying monsters that are under its control, and that makes it even more difficult to face them.
For all of their powerful, unique psionic abilities, what truly makes the Mind Flayer deadly is their intelligence. They are planners, plotters, and schemers, which will manipulate circumstances to give them the ultimate advantage. It is enough to say that if you are facing a Mind Flayer in combat, it is already probably too late.
In the depths of Volo's Guide to Monsters, we come to the final creature that we're talking about today, the Spawn of Kyuss.
The Spawn of Kyuss were the ultimate creation of an ancient archpriest of Orcus, Kyuss, who, according to legend, may have in fact attained divinity himself, being the archvillain of the classic 3rd edition Dungeon Magazine adventure, The Age of Worms campaign, a campaign which I ran and totally loved, and is what spawned my love for the Spawn of Kyuss.
The Spawn of Kyuss is a challenge rating 5 undead creature which can be found on page 192 of Volo's Guide to Monsters.
At first glance, the Spawn of Kyuss appears to be little more than a regular undead zombie. But once you get close, you can see the writhing mass of green worms burrowing beneath the putrid surface of its undead flesh.
The Spawn of Kyuss itself is not that scary until you take into account the worms that it has crawling all over its body, and the ways in which it can use those worms to torment a party by flinging them onto party members and having them burrow into their skin.
When the Spawn of Kyuss targets you with its burrowing worm ability, first the worm flies onto your flesh. You have 1 round to use an action to scrape it off you, or otherwise that worm will begin burrowing underneath your flesh, crawling through your skin until it reaches and devours your brain.
These worms cause damage every round, and you can be infested by more than 1 worm at a time.
While your body is infested by the worms of Kyuss, if you are reduced to 0 hit points, you immediately die. What's important here is that this occurs whether or not the damage that brought you to 0 hit points was caused by the worms or the damage of the Spawn of Kyuss's claw attacks or some other damage source. If there's a worm in your body and you're reduced to 0 hit points, you're dead.
But that's not even the end of this nightmare, as 10 minutes later you will rise up as your own Spawn of Kyuss.
I will never forget the first time I used a Spawn of Kyuss in one of my campaigns. I had a group of player characters that had no healing spells, no spells which could remove disease, and in fact, none of them even had proficiency in the medicine skill. The party managed to use fire damage to dispatch of the Spawn of Kyuss quite quickly, but at the end of the battle, the party's fighter was still infested with several of these burrowing worms, and the player characters had little recourse to do anything about it. The party's warlock decided to use Eldritch Blast to attempt to blow the worms out of the fighter's arms, which resulted in a rather messy amputation in the process.
It's also worth noting that the Spawn of Kyuss has regeneration and regains 10 hit points every round unless it's taken acid, fire, or radiant damage. This makes them a lot harder to kill.
Even if you do manage to scrape one of the worms off your skin, the worm is still active, and the Spawn of Kyuss can use its actions later to cause the worm that you flung off to jump right back onto you.
At low levels, fighting one Spawn of Kyuss can be a very deadly encounter, and as they get higher and higher levels, You can fight multiple of these, and the more of them there are, the more worms are being flung onto the party, and every worm causes a considerable danger for that party member to die.
Parties in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition often neglect to bring spells or other abilities which allow them to cope with the effects of diseases, and the spawn of Kyuss is a grim reminder to such groups that they need to be prepared for these eventualities. Of course, if you're lucky and you brought a paladin along with you, the spawn of Kyuss might not be a very terrifying threat, because the spawn of Kyuss's key vulnerability is that if you target the spawn itself with an ability that cures or removes diseases or curses, all the worms in its body are destroyed and it loses the burrowing worm trait. If you are not armed with its knowledge or the ability to act on this knowledge, the spawn of Kyuss's worms can very quickly overwhelm a party and turn them into their own host of undead monstrosities.
With their regeneration and their infectious nature, the spawn of Kyuss is a great candidate for the cornerstone monster of your zombie apocalypse D&D campaign setting.
And I would highly recommend that if you love the spawn of Kyuss, seek out those old issues of Dungeon Magazine for the Age of Worms campaign. I ran it myself several years ago, and it is one of the most memorable games I have ever run. It's a fantastic campaign, and given the monsters in it and the spawn of Kyuss in Volo's Guide to Monsters, it's pretty easy to convert it to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons.
As a final note, while researching this episode, we looked at a lot of classic Dungeons & Dragons monsters and considered them very highly for this list. Things like the Banshee, Medusa, the Basilisk, or the Slad. These were great candidates, but we find that the 5 that we picked stand out not just because of how deadly they are, but several of the ones that we chose are lesser known monsters, which can actually give them an edge and have the players know a little bit less about them, which makes them scarier.
Many of these monsters represent a deadly threat, and you can throw some serious curveballs at your player characters at these levels of play by using such deadly creatures. But it's worth remembering that at mid-levels of play, the player characters need to start playing smart, because they have the abilities to deal with these creatures, and if things go wrong, they do start gaining access to spells like Revivify and Raise Dead that allows them to clean up if they make a really serious mistake. Use these monsters in moderation. If you're throwing deadly threats at your player characters all the time, you're going to turn your campaign into a real horror show that will be a lot less fun for your players. But using these creatures once in a while to pose a unique challenge to your players will shake them out of getting too overconfident and make them rethink their usual default tactics.
So this has been a look at 5 deadly mid-level monsters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you feel like we missed any of your favorites, let us know about them in the comments below.
If you're enjoying our show, please consider supporting our work on Patreon. You can find out how you can support the channel by following the links in the description below.
If you want to see us tackle some deadly monsters, check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more coverage on all the deadly monsters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.